All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about chapters 9 and 10 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Um, it's important as we get into these chapters to reflect on what has happened here. Victor succeeds in creating his monster. He brings it to life after 2 years of work in Ingolstadt, Germany, brings the monster to life and instantly abandons it, runs out of his apartment, runs into Henry Clerval, and only when he returns the next morning to his apartment does he realize that the monster is gone. And again, the question you should have in your mind is, what happened to this monster? If it's not left in Victor's apartment, where did the monster go? And we will start to get answers to this as we move forward. Um, and so, after the creation of the monster, Victor falls into his fits or fevers, into a coma-like state for several months. But after he wakes up, he and Henry go on with their lives. In a time period of a couple of years goes by, while Victor and Henry resume college. They go back to Ingolstadt. They're studying together. Henry's learning new things. And Victor goes back to his classes, believing that maybe he's just lucky enough that this monster is no longer part of his life. But then he gets the letter in chapter 7, which lays out that his young brother has been murdered. And what does Victor discover when he finally returns to Geneva, Switzerland, some 6 years after leaving to head off to college? So now he's about 23, 24 years old. He finally returns to Geneva, Switzerland, visits the site of his brother's murder, and what does he find there but the monster? 6 years later, and it opens up so many questions. Number one, how did the monster get there? The monster, when it left Victor's apartment, had no idea who Victor was. It could barely speak. Victor never introduced himself. And the monster was created in Ingolstadt, Germany. How is it that this monster would find its way and end up in Geneva, Switzerland, a whole other country away, and just outside Victor's house? This all seems very convenient. And it also begs the question, and Victor becomes convinced instantly that this monster killed his brother. He's like, this is the one that must have strangled my brother. It obviously was him. But of course, the monster is not arrested. It's Justine Moritz. And we had talked about the evidence laid out against Justine Moritz, how they had found the locket in her pocket. And even though she laid out a defense, even though she has told Victor and Elizabeth that she did not commit this murder, she is found guilty and she is executed, which leaves Victor with a great sense of guilt. As we open in chapter 9, Victor is dealing with a great deal of internal conflict. Number one, he's feeling guilt over the fact that he created the monster and abandoned it. He's feeling guilt over the fact of William's death because he believes the monster killed William. He's convinced of it. And because of that, he's also feeling guilt over Justine's execution because he believes her to be innocent. But again, you have to ask the question as well, if she's truly innocent, how is it that she got the locket in her pocket in the first place? And if Victor believes that the monster killed his brother, Victor's also then feeling fear that the monster might go after other family members. And Victor's feeling guilt over the fact that Elizabeth is blaming herself. She is the one that gave the locket to William. She is the one who invited Justine to their house. And so Elizabeth is feeling guilt over the murder of William and the execution of Justine. All of this is weighing upon Victor as we move into chapter 9. And, at the beginning of chapter 9, Victor finds himself in a situation where he can't be around his family. Every time he's around them, you have to imagine, every time they try to console him, every time they come up to him and say, Victor, we're really sorry for your loss. What a terrible tragedy. They don't understand that they're making it worse for him. They're actually building on his own guilt. And so he starts to hide himself away from his family. And his father, in the beginning of chapter 9 here, his father notices this. His father notices that Victor, he says here to Victor, do you think, Victor, that I do not suffer also? No one could love that child more than I loved your brother. Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. But is it not the duty of survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness with immoderate grief? So his father's like, Victor, look, we're all sad, but it's time to get over this. It's time to move on with our lives. No one loved your brother more than I, and yet I'm not even weeping as much as you are. And he has no idea that he's actually making things worse on Victor when he has this conversation with him. And so, to try to cheer Victor up, Alphonse takes the family to Belle Reve. This is their country house. out in the mountains by the lake. He figures maybe getting out of the city of Geneva and going out to Bellerive, you know, maybe maybe this will cheer Victor up. And Victor, of course, is all about this because it gives him an opportunity to get away from his family. All he wants is to be alone right now. And so he starts spending hours rowing out into the middle of the lake. He's always by himself. He does discuss in chapter 9 here the possibility of suicide. He does make reference to, I thought about plunging myself into the lake, but, obviously he was worried. The thought of his father and surviving brothers, he said, prevents him from actually committing suicide. And it's during this time up at the house of Bellerive that Elizabeth has this conversation with him, this paragraph here. Elizabeth approaches him. She says, "When I reflect, my dear cousin, on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they appeared to me before. Before, I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others in tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters, thirsting for each other's blood." That line is key. Here's Elizabeth. What she's talking about here is, we discuss in class or we read about things like injustice, injustice in the legal system and things like that. And it's one thing to read about these things. But what Elizabeth is saying here is that you don't really truly understand injustice until you experience it for yourself. She is convinced that Justine Moritz was innocent. And she's like, I never really understood injustice until I felt it here. She questions in this paragraph, like, why would Elizabeth do this? She had nursed the child from birth. She was there was no motive for Justine to do these things. Um, Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? And then this line: I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice, towards which thousands are crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free and perhaps respected. But even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold of the same crimes, I would not change place with such a wretch. That line lends itself very well to an existential reading of this text, feeling like they're walking on the edge of this precipice here, on the edge of the world. Okay. And so Victor is riddled with a great deal of guilt. And what his family doesn't understand is the more that his family tries to make him feel better, the more they actually make it worse for him, because they're reminding him of all the guilt that he feels in the first place. And that brings us to chapter 10. Chapter 10, Victor again continues to try to isolate himself from his family. As he says it here at the beginning of chapter 10, I spent the following day roaming through the valley. He goes on these nature walks. He's just trying to get away from his family, because the more he's around them, the more they remind him of his guilt. We do have a Percy Shelley poem here referenced. Mary Shelley obviously pulling from her husband and alluding in the poem. We rest, a dream has power to poison sleep. We rise when wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or reason, laugh or weep, embrace fond woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow. Naught may endure but mutability. And this actually comes from a poem titled Immutability by Percy Shelley. So more allusions in the text. So Victor makes his way up into the mountains. He's going for a walk in the mountains to try to clear his head, to get away from all this, when all of a sudden we have this. As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man, at a distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. Excuse me. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. But I struggled quickly, restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived as the shape came nearer, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait for the approach and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred had deprived me of utterance, and I recovered to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. As Victor's up in the mountain taking this walk, he is confronted by his monster and comes running across the ice with superhuman speed. And as Victor sees it, Victor yells at it, "Devil, do you dare approach me? Do you not fear the fierce vengeance my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Be gone, or rather stay that I will trample you to dust." Victor's ready to fight this monster. And as the monster approaches, it speaks. "I expected this reception. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my Creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you thus sport with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them at peace. But if you will refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." Okay, first of all, the first question you should have in your mind is, how is it that the monster can speak? Remember, when we last saw the monster, Victor brought it to life something like 4 years ago. Brought it to life 4 years ago in his apartment. The monster could not speak. It was essentially a child. It groaned. And all of a sudden, 4 years later, Victor runs into this monster in the mountains of Belrive. And all of a sudden, the monster can speak, and speak well and eloquently, has a profound vocabulary. The question you should be asking yourself is, number one, what has the monster been up to for these 4 years that allows him to be able to speak? And so, the monster says, "I'm going to ask something of you, Victor." The monster wants something from Victor. And he says, "It's up to you. If you give this to me, if you do this for me, if you do my request, I will leave you alone. But if you don't, I will get vengeance." The monster gets in here. The monster says to Victor, "Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon and commiserate me, as you shall the judges that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense." Notice the monster also understands court and law. He's like, even in your court, guilty people are allowed to make an argument. And so the monster says to Victor, "Listen to my story. Listen to my story, at the end of which I will ask you for something that you must do for me." And so as we move into chapter 11, which we'll get into in our next session, when we move into chapter 11, the frame story takes on a whole new level here, because now we're going to have Robert Walton telling the story of Victor Frankenstein, who's telling the story of the monster. And chapter 11 begins the monster's narration. It's going to begin the monster telling Victor, up in this cave up in the mountains, what has happened to him in the time between his creation, the last time we saw him, and this moment here. And so all those questions you have about the monster and where he has been will start to be answered in chapter 11. That's all I have for you today. I hope this makes you well and healthy. And I will speak to you guys later.